The Speaking of Cults podcast is presented solely for general informational, educational, and entertainment purposes. The use of information on this podcast or materials linked from it is at the user's own risk. The views, information, or opinions expressed by the host and guests are solely those of the individuals involved and do not constitute medical or other professional advice. Hello, and welcome to the Speaking of Cults podcast. This is Chris Shelton, your host. Welcome to the show. This week, we are diving once again into the subject of large group awareness training. Now, there are various groups that typify or are examples of large group awareness training, and some of them are rather litigious. And like the Church of Scientology of old, they don't like it when they get bad press. But that's too bad because bad people doing bad things need bad press and they need exposure. So the point of this show is not necessarily to focus on any one of these groups, and we will sort of throw out, various names of various groups that maybe typify some of this behavior. But what I wanted to get into this week, and what I am very excited about, I will introduce my guest in just a moment, is the fact that large group awareness training is sort of the way I see it, at least, is you have different domains or different areas of activity that cult-like, authoritarian, manipulative, deceptive tactics are utilized in order to bring people in and in order to sell them something or convince them of something or give them an experience, which then convinces them of something. And you have your religious cults. You have your groups like Scientology. You have your non-religious cults, your groups like NXIVM. You have your large group awareness training activities, and you have like EST of old, and you have multi-level marketing schemes, which are kind of like business cults. And large group awareness training kind of falls in between these two things, at least as far as I can tell. But these are just broad categories I'm just sort of throwing out there. And the reason that I do is because it's interesting to me that people who survive or escape or get out of multi-level marketing schemes often don't think about the experience as a cult-like experience. They don't necessarily connect those dots right away. Neither do people who have gotten away from or escaped from large group awareness trainings right away. And I want to help be one of the voices of reason here to connect the dots with these different groups and sort of discuss here today, what is it that these groups are actually doing to the people who participate in the programs or activities, whether it's Scientology auditing or whether it's, in this case, we're going to be focusing on large group awareness training. So Dr. John Hunter is my guest this week. He is a doctor of psychology who operates out of South Africa, and he has studied some really interesting stuff, which he's going to share with us today, as to what's going on in the brain or mind of people who are attending these workshops, forums, seminars, weekend retreats, and why it's not necessarily what you're being told it is. And that's kind of the deception of the thing. So, Dr. Hunter, welcome to my show.
Hi, very good to be here.
Yeah, thanks for patiently waiting while I introed you there.
No problem.
Now, first off, you're down in South Africa. What is your profession or background that brought you to this topic and this field of research?
There's a little bit of a backstory. So I was, and this will make sense in a moment, but I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder in 2003. And for the next 7 years, I spent time trying to understand the disorder, trying to understand things that might lead to further episodes. So bipolar disorder can be really disruptive, high rates of suicide, affects relationships, affects your ability to work, all those sorts of things. I wanted to manage it as well as I could. And some of the things that I learned about were the triggers for further manic episodes. And manic and hypermanic episodes are these elevated states. It's kind of the opposite of depression. So think of depression as seeing the world through this really negative lens, and hypermania and mania, you're seeing the world through this really positive lens. And maybe, to use LGAT terminology, your context shifts. So the actual content of your life doesn't change when you're depressed, but everything seems worse. In the same way, when you're hypermanic or manic, nothing has to change in your outside world, but everything will seem to be better. You'll seem more full of hope and optimism and confidence and all these sorts of things. But mania can also be very problematic because people become too confident. They become grandiose. They might have, psychosis, delusions of grandeur, that sort of thing. They also might make impulsive decisions, spending a lot of money, quitting a job, getting divorced, making these really big decisions without really thinking about them. So it's something that has to be managed very well. So 2003 to 2007, I was just studying this informally. I wasn't at university. I'd actually had a business degree. And then in 2010, I started working at a company just outside of Durban in South Africa. And as often occurs with LGATs, people at the company basically said, well, in order to work at this company, you need to take part in these 2 personal development seminars. And that's often how they are presented. And they wouldn't give us any more information on them, even though we asked. We were told things like, you know what you know what you don't know, but you don't know what you don't know. And that's often a way that they are very, ambiguously described to people, because they don't want anyone to know any of the details about what happens. So I took part in this workshop. It ran over 4 days and very long hours, very psychologically stressful for the first sort of 3 days. A lot of confrontation, a lot of sharing of personal information, and then the trainer would ask people to accept responsibility for whatever they were sharing, be that getting beaten up, parents left you, raped, whatever it was, you need to be responsible for those things. A lot of exercises involving regression, confronting your mother and father. So thinking about these quite traumatic situations, and then very long hours, homework at the end of every night, which ended at 2 a.m. on Thursday nights and Friday nights. Saturday ended at 12 at night. So what we've got is a huge amount of psychological stress. You've got sleep disruption. And then on the final day, the atmosphere shifts very extremely. So the trainer, who has been, let's just say, confronting, but I would describe it as quite verbally and psychologically abusive, suddenly switches, and now, in this case, he is loving, and you've graduated and you're wonderful and you've got it. And so there's the sense of goal attainment. And so I'm sitting in the seminar, and having studied bipolar disorder, I know that 3 of the major triggers are psychological stress, sleep disruption, and goal attainment. So I'm drawing the connection, and I'm going, well, this is really quite bizarre. And we'd been promised something that they refer to as transformation after the seminar, at the end of the seminar. They kind of say, you'll pop, you will experience this incredible state of elevation. You'll have the best day of your life. And as somebody who'd been manic before, I've had some pretty good days, because mania feels incredibly good. So I was like, okay, well, that's a pretty big claim. Additionally, before I took part, I'd actually heard about people in the organization. So nobody would tell me what the training involved, but a couple of people said, quite a couple of people have been divorced straight after the training. And so that sort of stuck in my head as something, relatively impulsive. And then after the training, and during the training, the leader would promise certain things. He would say, you're going to feel better than you've ever felt before. You'll feel incredibly confident. You're going to have more energy. He actually said to us, and the words he used were, he said, don't go, you're going to be feeling unusually empowered. can I swear on this channel? If
Of
I'm
course you
directly
can.
quoting.
Absolutely. Let loose.
So he said, you're going to feel unusually empowered. Don't go home and tell your wife to fuck off. So he literally warned people about making big decisions over a certain period of time. And when I listened to the descriptions of what we were told to expect, and when I saw the behavior of participants in the seminar who weren't, as far as I know, bipolar, they were all displaying hypomanic symptoms. And some of them, I would say, manic symptoms. That was my initial observation. So I was like, okay, well, these things involve these established triggers for hypomania and mania. And what they were referring to as transformation looks very similar, if not identical, to hypomania, and in some cases, mania. And maybe just to make that distinction.
Yeah, I was going to ask you if you could, because I'm a little unclear. And you're saying, by the way, I want to be clear for the audience, hypomania is the term you're using, right? And I understood that to mean a lesser degree of something. So the term does I have questions with that term. What does that mean?
Great. So if we think of depression, if we think of normal mood kind of ranging between, the saddest you've ever been, the happiest you've ever been for normal people, a person who experiences a major depressive episode, they're going to be experiencing this level of sadness and hopelessness and lack of energy and whatever that really far exceeds what a normal person will experience. And the first time I experienced depression, it's kind of like, oh, there's levels to this, and you really are on a completely different level. Yep. Hypomania actually is the elevated mood state that is above the normal range of mood, but below mania. So hypo, meaning below, means below mania. And essentially the only difference between
an elevated state.
Yeah. So if you look at the DSM, for example, what they'll say is that the indicators or symptoms of hypomania are identical to those of mania, except they are less extreme and they don't have to last as long in order for the diagnosis to be made. So they have to last for at least a week to be diagnosed with mania. They have to last at least 4 days to be diagnosed with hypomania. They have to be less extreme. And if a person experiences psychosis, so delusions or hallucinations, or they're hospitalized, then they'll automatically be diagnosed with a manic episode. So even if it's just 2 days, if it's that extreme, it'll be diagnosed as mania rather than hypomania.
Okay, got it on that. Thank you for clarifying that. That actually helps a lot, because that's actually a term that I could and maybe should be using when I describe the results or effects of Scientology auditing on a person, because they will enter a state. And I have been in that state for sure. And it usually, I'm sure you've spoken with John about this, John Atack, where you will enter a state of this manic, this sort of very excited, very exuberant, very jubilant sort of feelings for about 3 to 5 days. That's what, and Hubbard himself even says, it's going to last about that long before, things start getting, kicking back in on you, is how he kind of puts it. But in fact, what they've done is induced hypomanic state.
Yeah. I presented my work at the International Cultic Studies Association conference last year, and it was a virtual presentation, so it was recorded, and you can actually find it on my website. And there was quite a lot of excitement about it. So there were people that had studied large group awareness trainings, and they were like, well, that is a very nice explanation of what goes on in these seminars. But there were also a lot of people who got hold of me and said, it seems like I can apply this to this other group that I'm interested in as well. And in fact, I've just written a book on Christianity and religious experiences, and I think a very similar process can be applied there as well. So feelings of guilt, shame, inadequacy, fear, uncertainty, those sorts of things suddenly replaced with love and affirmation and renewal and forgiveness and that kind of thing. That process seems to be used in a lot of different contexts, and it's an ambiguous process. it's interpreted based on what you've been primed to expect. So in a large group awareness training, you've been primed to expect transformation. Within religion, you might have been primed to anticipate an encounter with the Holy Spirit. So if you feel this sense of hope and joy and optimism and love, which is very much what hypomania can feel like, then you may interpret it as something different. So my relatively limited understanding of Scientology kind of gives me a sense that the auditing processes can be quite grueling. You're asked to repeat things over and over. They take a long time. You're revealing a lot of personal information. So that sense of confession, what's called sharing in large group awareness trainings, is quite similar. From the episode that you had with Ann Peterson, there's quite a bit of discussion about responsibility.
Yes.
And that's a huge thing in large group awareness trainings. It's probably the most important idea or most emphasized idea in LGATs. And even while I was doing my PhD, having watched Scientology and the aftermath, at some point, I can't remember who says it, but they said a major idea is the thing that you are responsible for everything that happens in your life. And I remember watching that and going, well, that's something that I'm quite familiar with. But the idea of responsibility it's superficially empowering, and it can be empowering. So you've got control and that sort of thing, but it also has got this implicit blame and guilt and shame when things are not going well, or when things have happened to you that are bad, that you're somehow at cause, or you could have done something to avoid this or to prevent it, or the way that you're interpreting the situation, which is a big thing in LGATs. The way that you're interpreting this is why you are feeling all of these negative emotions as a result, and you could just interpret it in another way. And what we know from psychology is that it's not as simple as that. You can't just say to somebody, think of your rape in a happy way, and if you're not, then you're entirely responsible for the feelings. And I don't want to caricature what goes on in LGATs, but if you read multiple examples from a number of organizations in my PhD, that's kind of what is communicated in, over and over and over again. So if that's not what they're trying to convey, they need to get a lot better at it, because they seem to be conveying those sorts of things with a fair amount of frequency.
Oh, for sure. It's not an accident. Not by any means at all is it an accident that the responsibility or the concepts around or synonyms of that word are utilized in this way. My idea, and I'm in alignment with what you've been discussing here, is that it's a double-edged sword. It empowers, but it also gives the organization or group that is empowering you a weapon against you later. Because when you first initially empower yourself with not just acceptance of an event that's occurred to you, like an essay or physical abuse or psychological abuse or whatever, you coming to a place of acceptance about that is a very important step for people in recovery. Coming to a place where you feel you were somehow the cause of it, that you were the one who spiritually or astrally or manifestly somehow brought that into your life through your actions or inactions, sets you up for future failure, for future blame by the organization for not doing what they want you to do, and so it's a way of actually handcuffing someone to a concept while pretending to liberate them, right?
Yeah, I would say with all of the exercises and interactions and whatever, you've got this marketed reason for why they are taking place, And what I would encourage everyone to do is to think of what is maybe another reason that this could be done. Because with all of them, you can kind of go, okay, well, that's what they're telling us it's for, but what other purpose does it maybe serve? Yeah.
That's right. That's right. Because we can line up Lifton's 8 points against this as well. You brought up sharing, confession, for example, as a mechanism of control. And it's a really, really powerful one because, again, you're empowering people to tear down their boundaries, be more open, be more communicative, be more in touch with the group. And there's this sort of, in a safe space, it feels like it's okay to do that. And you then let the guards down, but then they expect you to maintain that level of transparency with them from that point forward. And there's something wrong with you if you later on go, well, wait a minute, I have a couple boundaries I'd like to keep up here. I don't know that I really want to share all of that. Oh, no. You're not being responsible. See, you're not sharing the way you're supposed to. See, so they lock you into these bounded choices as Dr. Janja Lalich would model it. And I think that's not okay that people do that,
Yeah, and I mean, speaking of Lifton stuff, so I mean that's something that I actually cover as well in my PhD. It was kind of separate, and just while I was dealing with stress generation, which is a major element that I look at, I think pages 200 to 287 of my PhD dissertation are running through not just the 8 conditions, but also the idea of assault and leniency. So there's that additional element that Lifton speaks about. So this switching between assault and leniency. And so you ask yourself, well, does this occur in large group awareness trainings? And certainly it does. The first 3 days is assault, and then there's leniency. But even within that environment, there are periods of stress, and then there's maybe an exercise of relaxation, then stress, then relaxation. And then, so there's this kind of constant switch. If you speak about milieu control, so control of the environment, control of communication, certainly mystical manipulation, without question, there's so many examples of things going on that participants are not aware of in terms of how they are being affected. Participants, for example, have to applaud very frequently. And particularly when you're tired and you're not engaging what Kahneman would call system 2 thinking. So when you're not thinking analytically, then your mind starts just making connections between various things. So if you applauding every time that the trainer effectively wins an interaction with the participant and the participant has a breakthrough, then subconsciously you're saying, I agree with this, particularly as you get tired, because applause is associated with agreement. And there are multiple things like that that are going on that participants are unaware of. And so there's that. Then there's the demand for purity. So are there these standards of purity that are set? Certainly in terms of integrity and responsibility and commitment and all the rules that are put in place in these seminars. They kind of say, well, this is what you need to do in order to be meeting our arbitrary standards of purity. And then people will inevitably not meet those standards. And then that's used as a tool to generate, humiliation or guilt, or, you're not a very good person. Where's your integrity? That kind of thing. And then confession allows people to essentially cross over to this idea of I'm taking responsibility, because that's what it's really about. Share some example of something that you don't feel you're responsible for a lot of the time, and we'll work with you until you do agree that you're responsible for it. The sacred science, the person who's come up with a lot of these things, certainly in some organizations, I won't mention them, but they are held in very high esteem. And that's what Lifton says, is the originator of this work held in an incredibly high esteem. And can you question this process? And you see the way that the ideas are imposed during LGATs. You never hear a trainer or a facilitator say, actually, I was wrong. I think you're actually right. That doesn't happen ever. It's always a case of a person disagreeing, and then the trainer dominating that person until finally the person acquiesces and they're like, okay, I agree, breakthrough, applause. But that sacred science, passing understanding. And I think this is another thing that I think is highly relevant in LGATs, is that thinking is undermined, analysis is undermined. One of the primary things in EST, for example, was the idea that you should experience. You shouldn't believe something, you should experience something. And so they say, for example, understanding is the booby prize. In LifeSpring, they used to say things like, come from your heart, not from your heads. Participants are often reprimanded, you're being too analytical. Stop being so analytical. And again, there are multiple examples of this. So this technology or this way of thinking supersedes any individual thinking. It's true in all circumstances, and it seems to be very not open to criticism. Then you see loading the language. I mean, without question, if you speak to anyone who's gone through one of these seminars, often people in their lives that haven't gone through the seminars will feel quite frustrated because they're talking about possibility in a very particular way. Integrity has got a slightly different meaning. Enroll is being used all the time, and that's actually another form of mystical manipulation, because it won't just be enroll as in go out and enroll your family and friends to take part. It'll be things like, are you going to enroll in the possibility of X, Y, and Z? So it becomes this word that's constantly being used, which again is priming people to enroll, which in my view is the primary goal of many of these organizations. And then you've got number 7, which is doctrine over person, the idea that a person will say, well, this is what I went through, and then the environment or the people running the environment will say something like, actually, this is the way that you should interpret that thing that you went through. I mean, that's very basically what doctrine over person is. There was an undercover footage documentary on Landmark in 2004 by France 3 Television. I think it's available on the Internet Archive. And you see this woman getting up and saying, I feel like I'm being harassed. I've got people calling me and I'm telling them to stop, and I don't want them to call me. I'm being harassed. And the leader says, no, you're not being harassed. You're being supported. These people are wanting the best for you. I mean, that's a perfect example of doctrine over person. Their own interpretation is pushed aside, and they're convinced that it's something else, and that something else happens to be in line with the goals of the organization. And you see later that woman actually buys into it, and she's like, actually, I'm happy that I stayed, and it was great, and all that sort of thing. And then finally, you've got dispensing of existence. And so Lifton speaks about people and non-people. In some organizations, you hear about graduates and non-graduates. At the end of the seminar, the leader effectively says, you are now people. You're no longer non-people. You've graduated. You're one of us. And so when people will say, well, I took part in one of these things and there's no manipulation going on, my response is, well, how well do you understand some of the manipulation processes? Lifton's probably the most recognized of the academic descriptions. It's the most detailed. It's the least ambiguous. So if you look at Shine, it's kind of unfreezing, changing, refreezing, but that's pretty broad. Lifton, you can really look at each thing one by one and ask yourself the question of whether that's taking place. So my view is that people can maybe say, I don't think that thought reform works very well, but I think it's very difficult to argue that the steps of thought reform are not taking place to some degree in those environments.
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt about that at all. And thank you for breaking that down so completely like that. One second. I was just thinking of something I wanted to say about what you were just talking about there. Oh, yeah. Steve Hassan always has a great rejoinder to this idea of, well, I don't feel like I was manipulated. Okay. So how would you know if you're brainwashed? How would you know if you were being manipulated? I mean, sometimes when it's when it's clumsy or the person's fumbling about, then you can see that they're trying to manipulate, but they're not doing a very good job if you can see it. It's when you see it. It's like digital special effects, right? It's like, oh, this movie didn't have any digital special effects. No, it did. You just didn't notice them because they were so good that they just seamlessly blended into the background versus, the Marvel superhero movies where you can always tell, or the Star Wars stuff. So it can be done in such a way, so subtly, that you will not know. And that's really the key to all of this, is because people's egos are their number one enemy when it comes to and their egos are the number one ally of the manipulators, because if they don't believe they can be manipulated, these people who talk about how advertising doesn't work on them, I just have to laugh every single time I hear this, because I know better. It's just one of those things where when you're educated in it, you go, okay, well, you can think that, but you're the exact epitome of exactly who the marketing agencies want to be reaching.
Yeah, well, I mean, Margaret Singer refers to the myth of the invulnerable mind. And in psychology, we've got a term called illusory superiority. So this is the idea that people often rate themselves as more competent, particularly on subjective things. So on things like sense of humor, where you can't objectively measure it, everyone thinks that they've got a better than average sense of humor. But even things like driving, it's something like 90% of people think that they're better than average drivers,
Right,
so
right. And
those are some of the things. I mean, but in terms of that thing of people kind of saying, I can't be manipulated. I mean, even if you read some of the comments under that video with Ann Peterson, there's some people that will say she wasn't manipulated, she chose to do everything, whatever. But what they're really saying is that I wasn't manipulated, because if she wasn't manipulated, it means that I wasn't manipulated either. And often, again, I will say to people, if they say I'm not vulnerable to manipulation, I'll say, oh, so you make decisions based on looking at all of the evidence? Yes. And then I'll say, well, have you read Lifton? Have you read Shine? Have you read Cialdini? Have you read Singer? Like, what do you actually know about the manipulation process? Well, I've never read any of those things. So basically, you're making this decision based on wanting to feel like you can't be manipulated. Yes. So you're making the decision based on an emotion. Yes. So the manipulation process involves using heuristics like emotions and basically going around critical thinking. And you've literally just revealed that you are the type of person that will make a decision without understanding all of the detail and make it based on decision. So the irony is quite evident when people make that argument.
Right. It's, I have said many times over the years, I've stated this as a certain truth, that when you're down the spectrum of extremism, so to speak, when you're really buying into ideas so fully, so completely, you identify with them so thoroughly that you make them part of how you conceive of your self-image, of yourself, you lose the ability to think critically about it. And I've said this many, many times that when you get into a cult mindset, this extreme mindset, a radicalized mindset, there's a lot of words for it. You're down a scale where the ability of the frontal lobes to engage and critically think and ask questions and be skeptical, that all goes away because you've accepted it so hard. But we're all there already on certain things. Our ego puts us there. You just gave a great example of that, where somebody's not necessarily being controlled into thinking that they can't be manipulated. They're just demonstrating an ego problem that they don't want people to think that they're able to be manipulated. But that's because there's shame connected with it. And the fact of the matter is, there is no shame to it. We do it to each other all day, every day. Husbands and wives, children to their parents, parents to the children, bosses to their subordinates, the subordinates to the bosses. We're constantly manipulating people around us for our own ends. So the idea that somebody is immune to that is such a self-deception that it's actually, it's silly. It's a silly thing to even really put forward, but a lot of people do.
I would say it's they don't want to acknowledge to other people that they're vulnerable, but even more so to themselves, they don't want to acknowledge that they're vulnerable. And in terms of that ability to think critically, so certainly in some groups, getting people very tired and overloading them with information, which occurs in LGATs while you're in the LGAT, but unless you become a staffer or whatever, and I don't really know much about that side of things, but in other groups, they spend a lot of time getting people tired, overloading them with information, providing them with information that's quite confusing, so very jargon filled and that sort of thing. So people eventually lack the motivation and ability to think about that specific topic. But what I would say is that people don't lose the ability to think rationally generally unless they are constantly tired and depleted. So if you had to speak to a Scientologist, for example, and you showed them information on Keith Raniere or some other group leader, they'd probably go, this guy's clearly manipulative, and you can look at his background and he's a liar and whatever. But when they're looking at L. Ron Hubbard, then they're going to go, they're not going to be able to acknowledge that. And likewise, the person that's involved in NXIVM is going to look at L. Ron Hubbard and say, well, I don't think that he was a nuclear physicist or won a Purple Heart or whatever. That seems pretty unlikely. I believe these stories, whereas somebody that's in the organization doesn't want to acknowledge them. So that cognitive dissonance is massive. And the more time you spend with the group, the more you invest in terms of money, in terms of recruiting other people, and those sorts of things, the more difficult it subconsciously becomes to acknowledge problems. And the more traumatic it's going to be when you finally say to yourself, okay, there's enough information now that I can no longer go along with this organization. And that's why, people like yourself and John and Anne and various other people that I've interacted with or seen, I think it's hugely underestimated how difficult it is and how much courage it takes to look at that thing in the face and say, okay, I'm going to have to acknowledge all of these things that I've been doing and that I've been involved in, and generate a new life and a new way of looking at things and that sort of thing. I think it's incredibly difficult.
It is. I can definitely tell you from personal experience, it is definitely difficult. And every day is kind of different, and you have your ups and your downs. I should have been clearer earlier when I was talking about the critical thinking thing, that it is incredibly context specific, as you described.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating, but again, it has to do with the ideas and beliefs we accept. If you're accepting, very broad ideas, then there might be broad areas of life that you're just not going to think critically about, versus maybe more specific Scientology, let's say. Yes, I'm a nuclear physicist, and I can go to work and do nuclear physics, and I can be very critical and very smart about that. But then I go down to the Church of Scientology, and somehow I'm able to park all of that so that I can actually believe that L. Ron Hubbard was a nuclear physicist. And you think, how do these two things? Well, that's the miracle of the human mind, is that it actually can entertain two completely mutually exclusive ideas at the same time. But there are consequences to doing that. This is Bateson's double bind theory, which I just absolutely love. I think it's brilliant. as an explanation for how the mechanics of a psychotic thought process or trap that, you know, this sort of loop that you can get into with the double binds. How do they do it? You've been studying dopamine, neuroscience, you know, the transformation process. I have been asked, well, what does happen in a large group awareness training? And maybe we could be generalized enough, because across these groups, right, we don't have to go, oh, well, this group does, right? Instead, it's sort of just here's how the process basically works. The roots of a lot of this, by the way, are to be found in Scientology, as well as, I'm sure, other groups. Hubbard talked in the 1950s about different methods of questioning and group processing and group activities that I can relate now to LGATs and go, that's not interesting. Which you reminded me of earlier. Like, for example, the questioning, where you're going to talk to somebody and it looks like you're asking them questions, but you're actually leading them to a very specific answer in front of a group of people. Hubbard talked about exactly how to do that in a lecture in 1957 about education, you know, things like that. So I'm not saying he was the inventor of all this. I'm just saying it's interesting how techniques get lifted from different places and then put together into LGATs, because LGATs were not around in the 1880s. This is a fairly recent phenomenon. Is that right?
Yeah. So I mean, the different LGATs have got different influences, but there's also quite a lot of commonality. So in 1967, there was an organization called Mind Dynamics, which really was, it might be considered the one organization that led to a number of different large group awareness trainings. I wouldn't personally qualify it as a large group awareness training. But then there were also things like, there were sensitivity groups and encounter groups within humanistic psychology in the sort of 40s, 50s, encounter groups in the 60s. And then large group awareness trainings really began with, I would say, with Est or Erhard seminars training in 1971. 1974, there was LifeSpring, which was John Hanley and Randy Revel and Charlene Aframo and Robert White and a couple of other people. But soon it just became John Hanley. So that was 1974. There was Psy World, which was Thomas Wilhite. And there were a number of other organizations. Stuart Emery formed something called Actualizations, although he was the first CEO of Est and then went and formed his own organization. All of those people worked as trainers at Mind Dynamics. So they were all at this one organization.
Oh, wow.
And we're all working under, well, the person running Mind Dynamics was a guy named Alexander Everett. And Mind Dynamics was more about, it's often been likened to transcendental meditation. So putting people into an alpha state. So if you think of an EEG and brainwaves kind of slowing down and that kind of thing. So it had a lot to do with the guided visualizations, with maybe self-hypnosis or group hypnosis, those kinds of things. It wasn't, at least initially, it wasn't particularly harsh. Okay, so the stress wasn't a major element of it, but it seemed to generate some really positive experiences in people. It was shut down, I think, in 1973 for practicing medicine without a license and trying to make diagnoses and that sort of thing. So that was the one major organization. And Mind Dynamics was just next door and was kind of run by an organization called Holiday Magic, which was owned by a guy named William Penpatrick. And Holiday Magic was shut down as well for basically being a multi-level marketing organization. So
that's what I thought I'd heard of that before. Yeah, MLM.
So there was certainly this MLM influence or close association with Mind Dynamics. And then William Penpatrick had another organization called Leadership Dynamics Institute. And this was quite a crazy, maybe you could call this a large group awareness training, although it was very unsophisticated. But in terms of the descriptions, and Stephen Pressman, who wrote the biography on the unauthorized biography on Werner Erhard, he talks about Erhard's participation in leadership dynamics. Mark Fisher of the Washington Post in 1987 wrote about John Hanley's participation in leadership dynamics. And they say things like people were whipped and beaten and tied to crosses and locked in coffins and made to eat vomit and feces and humiliated. And in one example, a man was forced to fillet an artificial penis while women doing the female version of the seminar were brought in to watch. And so you may be asking yourself, well, why on earth would anyone be put through this? And this kind of relates to the idea of the sacred science. It's kind of like, what I believe is that people have stumbled upon these processes. They've kind of done these things and found out that they work. They don't know why they work. There wasn't the neuroscientific understanding at the time. They've literally just stumbled upon them. So there's actually a book, I don't know if you've read a book called Dopamine Nation. So it came out, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, by Dr. Anna Lemke from Stanford University. And it's all about addiction and dopamine, which we'll get onto in a second. But she says, for example, one of her patients who was addicted to some form of drugs stopped taking drugs, but then he hadn't dealt with the underlying issues leading to his addiction. And so he needed something to fill that gap. And he found that after taking a really cold shower, he felt this sort of elevated mood afterwards. And then he kind of progressed from that cold shower to taking cold baths and then colder baths and then colder baths. And he realized the more pain he went through, the greater his euphoria afterwards. And they've done studies and they've found that, in 12 degrees Celsius, if you put a person in 12 degrees Celsius water for an hour, their dopamine levels will be elevated for 3 hours to the same level as if a person takes cocaine. So if a person takes like fair amounts of cocaine, it may last, I don't know, I'm not a cocaine person, but 15 minutes, 20 minutes, seems like they're going to the bathroom relatively often. But this will last for 3 hours. And so this person doesn't understand the neurobiology of what he's doing. He's just found something. He's realized that if he does it more extremely, it leads to a more extreme result. And I think that that's what's going on with large group awareness trainings. As you say, they've kind of cobbled things together from various other processes. They found out that they work. They've kept the things that work. They've got rid of the things that don't work, but they haven't really known what they were doing. So leadership dynamics, I think, played a very big role in mind dynamics becoming more confrontational. And certainly, I would say, in large group awareness trainings, having that element, because as Pressman explains, after all of the stress of the leadership dynamics seminar, people felt incredibly elevated, incredibly, I think, giddy and jovial spirits were the words that they used. And they wouldn't have known why it was happening, but that's kind of what my research is about. And this is also, sorry, I'm speaking quite a lot. But this is...
I'm more than happy for you to. This is fascinating.
This is also why, when you said earlier, I don't think that it's accidental that when they speak about responsibility, it's generating guilt and shame. Because my view is that these seminars have evolved to generate these experiences, but particularly the larger seminars have also had to evolve to avoid lawsuits, to avoid criticism for various things. So in the past, you might have had a seminar leader screaming at participants and swearing at them. Certainly in the 70s and 80s, that was happening a lot. And even more recently, you have reports of that. And smaller organizations can probably still get away with it. But you can generate just as much stress, and that stress can be physical or psychological, by what you say to a person, by what they believe about themselves, by So you can get a person to go through something incredibly stressful. It doesn't have to be cold or heat or whatever. It can be psychological stress, and that's all got to do with the way that things are said, the way that things are communicated,
Right.
getting people to feel guilt and shame and inadequacy and fear and those sorts of things.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's true. You're trying to induce different states. And there's a lot of ways to do it. And as you said, they experiment. They just work and work and work and work and work at it. And they have this the steady group, groups of people showing up. And they go, okay, let's try tweaking this. Okay, let's try tweaking that. Okay, let's see if this works. Okay, let's try that. And that's how these things evolve over time.
I would say so.
Yeah. Yeah. How, wow. So what does make it? Because you said, okay, well, you had mind dynamics, which wasn't really an LGAT, and then you had leadership dynamics, which kind of started getting into some really kind of off the rail stuff. And from this, we evolve out into these various groups. What is it that makes a group or makes an activity a large group awareness training? What are the characteristics?
Sure. I would say that the way to explain it would probably be using a Venn diagram, because any organization is probably going to be able to say, well, I don't do that, or I don't do that. So I would start off with for example, the setup. So typically in large group awareness trainings, you're going to be recruited by a family member or a friend. So the way that you're recruited is always going to be through word of mouth. Typically, it might be through a volunteer that's working for the organization. So that's one of the things. Typically, they're going to say to you, I can't tell you anything about the experience. It will ruin it for you, but trust me, you need to take part. So they've often been primed to sell the seminar like that. When you arrive at the seminar, it's usually going to take place over 3 to maybe 5 days. So maybe from a Wednesday to a Sunday, or Thursday or Friday to Sunday. And then typically there might be a day on Monday where you are essentially not doing anything. And then often on a Tuesday, there's a graduation event where you ask to bring, potential recruits. I mean, it's marketed as this is a graduation, but it's quite clear that a primary purpose is to recruit other people. When you go to the seminar, often you'll be asked to sign a disclaimer. So I won't reveal any information about people. I agree to take full responsibility for my mental health. Some of the bigger organizations explicitly warn people with bipolar disorder. Is actually one of the first things that some of them say. If you've got bipolar disorder or have experienced psychosis, we strongly recommend that you don't participate. But then also things like depression, if you're seeing a psychologist, those kinds of things. So they do attempt to screen people out, whether the motivation for that is to avoid lawsuits, or whether it's genuine concern. I think anyone can speculate.
Genuine concern. Okay. That's going way out of your way to give them the benefit of the doubt.
So, and then when you get into the seminar, typically the first part of the seminar involves running through the rules. So, and there are a number of rules that you have to agree to before you're allowed to stay. So they differ from organization to organization. So it might be things like you can't speak to anyone in front of you, behind you, that sort of thing. They might say you need to change chairs, so you can't sit next to somebody that you know. And that's got something to do with, in my opinion, removing social support, which is a way of reducing stress. So if you've got social support, it can reduce stress or mitigate some of the effects of stress. You can't take drugs or alcohol while you are participating. And I believe that it's because the transformation is neurobiological. So they're doing something to your brain chemistry, and using a depressant like alcohol may have a particular impact. Using a stimulant like amphetamines or cocaine might push things in the other direction. And so my view is that that rule may have evolved because it allows them to better understand what the results are going to be. Okay, so they run through
interference in what they're trying to do.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Generally, you're not allowed to take notes, and that's actually very important in terms of something called the peak end rule, or the experiencing versus the remembering self. And I can maybe speak about that a little bit later.
Mm-hmm.
But essentially, people are going to be so tired and exhausted by the end of the 3 or 4 or 5 days that their memory of the event is going to be based on how it feels at the end and how it feels at the peak. And that's going to be very good. But if you've got a notebook and you've been writing, this was really uncomfortable, I can't believe that, so my view is that this is a tactic that allows them to take advantage of something called the peak end rule, which you can read about in Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. It's quite a well-established thing within psychology. So they get you to agree to a bunch of rules. They basically say, are you going to be coachable? Are you committed to staying throughout the training? So another big thing that they do is they really don't want you to leave halfway through, because the process requires that you go through stress over 3 or 4 or whatever days, get your body responding in a particular way. You become psychologically hypervigilant, and then the removal of the stress and the replacement with reward and affirmation are crucial in order to generate the experience. If you leave halfway through while you're frustrated with everything, that can be a problem. So a lot of the organizations will say things like, the seminar is like a roller coaster. It's, there's going to be ups and downs. It's going to feel frightening, but it's very dangerous to get off halfway through. In my course, the seminar leader said it's like a course of antibiotics. You need to finish it for it to work properly. So there's kind of this fear of leaving halfway through. And then there's also the sense of commitment's a very big thing. So they get you to commit to completing the seminar. Oh, you trust your friend, you trust this person that's brought you in, and you're never going to understand the process. And you've been told as well, listen, it's going to be uncomfortable. You're not going to understand it, but trust me, wait until the end. And that's why people don't tend to leave. Because, often when I've spoken to people about these things, they'll say, well, I'd have just gotten up and left. And it's kind of the same as when we're talking about people saying, I can't be manipulated. There have been a lot of studies done on LGATs, and consistently it's like, well, 70% of people have got college degrees. Another 20% of them have got master's degrees or other professional qualifications. And so the evidence suggests that it's people that are very capable of critical thinking, and they don't get up and leave. There's obviously a reason for that. So,
well, I'd say there are multiple reasons for that.
Yeah. And also there's this promise of this incredible transformation. So the person that's recruited you has been in this elated state, and they're just like, my life has turned around and it's wonderful and whatever. They don't recruit you 3 weeks afterwards. They recruit you in the day afterwards, on that Monday or on that Sunday or whatever. Maybe just a comment on the roller coaster. None of these people that's designed, and I use the word designed very loosely, LGATs, they didn't have backgrounds in psychology. They don't have a good understanding of these things. So to me, it's like a roller coaster that's been built by some guy who quite enjoys DIY. I wouldn't get on that roller coaster. You want it to be built by somebody who's a mechanical engineer or something like that.
Well, yeah, but then there's safety rails, and then there's guidelines to protect you, and then there's informed consent, and we can't have any of that.
Yeah, I struggle to see how there is informed consent if people are effectively told, don't reveal the details about
my point. Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So that's your basic framework for a generic LGAT organization, is that kind of setup and that kind of layout. And
maybe what I should also say is the actual exercises then that
I was going to ask about that.
So LifeSpring, for example, was broken up into 3 components, and LifeSpring and EST are considered to be the sort of 2 major LGATs from the 1970s and at least early 1980s as well. And so in Hanley's book, he speaks about three things. He speaks about distinctions, and these are often concepts. So talking about what is integrity, what is enrollment, what is authenticity, what is trust and commitment and whatever.
This is where they load the language.
Yes.
Yeah, this is where they give you the spinny definitions of these concepts so that you can do the inner dialogue speak of the inner group and understand that responsibility really means not just being able to respond, or not just being able to have a sense of ownership or cause for something, but no, you are responsible for everything. That's where they introduce this kind of stuff.
Yeah, exactly, and that obviously is quite important for the third phase. But the second group of things is the exercises. So these might be things like guided meditations. They might be structured mingles. So in LifeSpring, for example, people were asked to, after a long lecture on what trust is, they were asked to walk up to people and basically say to them either, I trust you, I don't trust you, I don't know whether I should trust you, I don't care whether to say whether I trust you or not. And that seems relatively benign, but imagine somebody looks at you and kind of says, I don't trust you. Or imagine what it feels like to say to somebody, I don't trust you. And so there were those kinds of things. There's 2 major splits in terms of the sorts of exercises that you would expect to see in these seminars. So the ones that have been spin-offs of LifeSpring, and Hanley estimates that there are hundreds, and I don't think that he's understating that. I think that there are hundreds of organizations that are effectively using the LifeSpring technology. And so you'll hear about things like the red and black game, the lifeboat exercise. They're very specific things that individuals will do in these seminars. In the second level, or the advanced level of LifeSpring, participants might be asked to dress down a lot or take quite a lot of their clothes off, and people will make comments about their bodies in quite a not necessarily kind way. But you've got LifeSpring on the one side, which is made up of hundreds of organizations, none of them called LifeSpring. I mean, the seminar that I took part in, I would say was 80% LifeSpring, 20% EST. And then you've got the organizations that are born out of EST. So EST, the organization, was around from 1971 to 1981, and then it was replaced by Werner Erhard and Associates. And at some point, I think in 1985, they stopped offering the EST training and they started offering something called the Forum. And then in 1991, Werner Erhard and Associates basically sold its technology to what was known as Landmark Education. I think in 2013, it became known as Landmark Worldwide. They are very careful about protecting their copyrights and protecting the technology that they claim to have developed. I feel like
even calling it technology is I can't help but think echoes of Scientology. That's the term they use for the methodology.
Exactly.
The technology, as though this is some industrial strength invention of the industrial age or something.
Yeah, I mean, I can actually, I know that you did ask the question about the relationship between Scientology and EST, and in Erhard's authorized biography called The Transformation of a Man. This is by Bartley in 1978. There's a whole chapter on Scientology. And Earhart speaks with quite a lot of affection about L. Ron Hubbard. So initially, I mean, he refers to him as a genius.
Yeah.
So that relationship that's often presented as not existing or being relatively distant, I think is, there's some evidence that that's not the case. But yeah, so you've got these LifeSpring type seminars, and then you've got Landmark, and they use slightly different things. So, for example, and I mean, a number of journalists have written about this particular exercise. They've got something called the fear exercise, where they lead participants through this guided meditation, and they ask them to feel afraid of the person next to them, and afraid of everyone in the room, and then afraid of the whole world. And it's done in clearly a very compelling way, because whether it's a person in Paris or New York or Australia or wherever talking about it, they all say that participants are screaming and wailing and crying and sobbing and all sorts of things. And then right at the end of the exercise, the fear is removed and replaced with, it was kind of all a joke, and maybe people are more afraid of you than you are of them. But essentially, this process of psychological stress removed or basically just removed, and it seems to generate these elevated states in some participants. So
can I stop for a second? I want to segue into something real quickly, and then get back to this structural analysis of what's going on in the events. There's a point I think that needs to be made, and I probably should have made it earlier. I've made it a few times on my show. Just because it feels good doesn't necessarily mean it's good for you. Can you speak to that? Because you've mentioned elevated states, dopamine. You've mentioned some neurotransmitter, neuroscience type stuff. These are states of your brain where chemicals are at work, and it creates feelings within us throughout our body of what we associate with not just pleasant feelings, but excited, vibrant, alive feelings. Like you're electrified. There's an energy generation with these feelings that puts us into a place where we're smiling, laughing, happy. But I don't know that it's actually the same kind of healthy happiness that we would associate with spending time with a loved one, or the birth of a child, or the pleasure you get from, hanging around with a pet, or something like, or an accomplishment that you accomplish, right? Some goal you set and then you accomplish it. I think that there's a difference. Maybe the difference is only context, but could you speak to that for a second?
Sure. I mean, I think the obvious example is taking certain drugs. I mean, so you aren't changing anything in your external environment, but you might feel a lot better. So if you are using alcohol, you might feel more relaxed. So alcohol, among other things, is going to target GABA, which is a neurotransmitter that's relating to just relaxing everything. So everything kind of just becomes a lot more relaxed. But if you know what it feels like after you've used alcohol, and it's different for different people, then often people feel quite anxious maybe the next day or for the next couple of days, because then suddenly your brain has to get back to normal. The same if you're taking something like cocaine. So that's going to be elevating dopamine more than anything else. So dopamine and norepinephrine and adrenaline will be affected as well. But dopamine is this chemical in your brain that is responsible for seeking. So often people have thought about dopamine as being the pleasure chemical. More recent studies reveal that dopamine's got more to do with the anticipation of pleasure than pleasure. So in order for us to survive, we need something that motivates us. So we need to be able to kind of look at a particular goal and say, it's worth my time and energy to pursue that goal. Dopamine is the chemical that elevates when we do something that's rewarding. But so initially dopamine's elevated when we do something rewarding, but then it comes to be associated with the anticipation of that thing. So it starts to become associated with anything that might lead you to get that reward, and it motivates the behavior to do it. So for example, they've bred rats that just don't produce dopamine, and they'll put food just next to them and they won't turn their heads to get it because they're not motivated to do it. But if you give the rat food, the rat will eat the food and will enjoy the food. So it's not about the pleasure of consumption, it's about the pleasure of anticipation. And so you mentioned things like aliveness and excitement. I mean, that's all associated with, I think things are going to be amazing. You've got this optimism and energy. And so, if you think of cocaine, if you think of, crystal meth or methamphetamines or those sorts of things, those are targeting dopamine in the mesolimbic pathway. But to get back to your question, you feel great for a while. It shifts your context, which is a term that LGATs might often use. But you don't become wealthier, you don't become better looking, you don't become whatever as a result of taking the drug, but it maybe makes you feel like that's the case. So it shifts your perception of reality temporarily. And if you speak to people that have taken part in large group awareness trainings, they often speak about this incredible experience. And then you ask them, well, how long did it last? A couple of days, maybe a couple of weeks. And there may be people who use that experience as the thing that allows them to maybe make changes in their lives. And maybe those changes are really great and whatever. But if that elevation is like hypermania or mania, which I'll argue it is, what I've been fooled by this state so many times, so this is not about kind of saying to people, you're idiots for falling for this. Yeah. I've studied this thing. I've got a PhD on bipolar disorder and large group awareness training. And if I'm hypermanic, I'll still make silly decisions. I'll still think that I'll feel like I'm forever transformed, but it's always something transient. And it's the same as when a person's depressed. If you speak to a person who's depressed, you can explain to them, this is a temporary thing. In a couple of weeks, a couple of months, things are going to be better. To them, it feels like it's permanent. It feels like I understand what the world is like. I understand my value. I understand, and it's not good. The same thing happens when you're in these elevated states. It feels like this is who I am. It doesn't feel like this is something that's fleeting. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it does. It leads and it goes in exactly where I wanted to go with it, because this is one of those, like, it's so tricky. Just even talking about this is really rough because, what are you saying? That you don't want people feeling good? And it's like, no, of course we want people feeling good. Of course it feels great to feel good. But I think the example you just gave really highlights the point. If you're talking to somebody, and many of us we've either experienced it or have had to, dialogue with people who are experiencing a depressive episode or an anxiety episode, like a place where, this person is looking and thinking about the world, their world, through a very negative lens, through a series of filters in their mind that convince them that the world is awful, that it was always awful, that it was never going to be anything else but awful, and they really don't even have a place in it, depending on the level of depression. I've experienced myself. I've experienced and I've spoken with my wife and other people in my life who have been in the doldrums of that. And when it's bad, it's bad. And I think all of us can relate to this in one fashion or another. So we can say, with some degree of certainty and even hope, look, it's not going to stay this way. It's going to get better. You're going to change your view about things. What you're seeing, the important part is what you're seeing right now, or what you're experiencing when you're in that state of mind, is to a degree, we could use words like this, a delusory look at the world. It's not, nothing changed. The world is exactly like you said before. The world's the same. You're looking at it differently. And if that's not real, if those negative thoughts and negative ideas, and I shouldn't even be here in this world, if those aren't true, and we can say that with certainty to somebody who's in a negative state, flip the script. It's no different with somebody who's on a manic high. And I'm not talking about somebody having a happy day. Organically having a good day. That's great. That's life. That's the ups and downs of life. But when we induce a manic or hypomanic state in somebody, we are, as you say, we're elevating their mood. We're elevating their view of the world to a place which is too much. It's not reality. They're looking at the world through a false sense of empowerment, responsibility, entitlement, privilege. There's a lot of words we can throw on this pile, but it's not a very accurate look at the world. And that's the danger that's inherent in it. It's not that it's bad to feel good, but what you can end up doing as a result of those feelings can be very destructive to your life in the long term because you're not thinking clearly. And I think that's the point. Am I getting this right?
Yes, no, and I mean, I think that the distinction needs to be made as well. I mean, I think that LGATs have evolved so that the majority of participants, if you think of like a normal distribution of people taking part in terms of their stress tolerances, because I think what's happening is a stress response, and different people are going to have different stress responses in terms of their biology, in terms of their psychology, in terms of things that they've been through. So depending on what's discussed is going to affect people differently. I think that they've evolved so that the majority of people experience an elevated state. They feel transformed. They probably don't make any terrible decisions. They just feel great. And I don't think that there's too much of a problem with that, other than assuming that it's something that's going to be lasting. And so,
as long as they don't go home and divorce their wives, right?
But I'm saying for the majority of people,
yes.
Fine. And so, and then I would say you've got some people on the one side of that curve who probably go through it and go like, what was that? There was nothing. And then you get these other people on the other side, and they might experience more extreme elevations, maybe more manic symptoms. They might be the people that quit their jobs or gamble their money or spend too much or whatever. And then you might have these other people who experience psychosis. And there have been multiple claims over the last 50 years of psychosis as a result of participation. The organizations have always said, well, what have we got to do with psychosis? People can have psychotic episodes going to the shop or whatever. So I would say that for the majority of people, you might experience the elevated state, come back down. But what I would say is that the elevated state is used as a tool of influence.
Right.
So even if you don't have, psychological problems as a result of participating, I would say that there's something else that needs to be looked at there.
Well, this is how the manipulation happens.
Yeah.
Right.
So
you put somebody into a state, and you made the point earlier that I've made so many times on this channel as well, which is it requires pre-priming. It requires this is what we're setting you up for. Yeah. So that when you arrive there, you assign the reason for why you arrive there to what they told you. Oh, this is why I feel better. In Scientology, you have an auditing session. The same elevated states are induced. Yeah. But the interpretation of the event is, oh, well, you went exterior. You went out of your body. That this proves you're a spiritual entity, see? Yeah. Because they set you all up for it. They don't spring that on you at the end. Surprise, you're a Thetan. They tell you at the beginning, you're a Thetan. You're a spiritual entity having a physical existence, and we're going to prove it to you. And we're going to put you in a session, and you're going to feel great, and that's going to prove it. And then you put you in a session, and then you feel great, and then you go, oh, I guess they were right. because you don't have any other explanation for what just happened to you.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So maybe just the actual neurobiology of what goes on in the seminar then. I think that's obviously the loop that needs to be closed.
Yep.
And very briefly before then, I realized we ran through two of the elements of the thing. So there was distinctions and exercises. And then the third element is sharing. So this is when people explain something that they've been through, and then often this is where they're asked to take responsibility and that kind of thing. And obviously the distinctions about what responsibility is, etc., and whatever play a role in convincing them that they are responsible later on. Okay, so after I took part in the seminar, I said to myself, okay, it involves these triggers for bipolar disorder, stress, sleep disruption, and goal attainment, and it leads to these symptoms that are associated with hypomania and mania. And just to run through those, this would be things like a positive lens, so the world seems more positive, euphoria, confidence, energy, a lack of need for sleep, high levels of productivity, often a sense of creativity, so being able to link ideas in an interesting sort of way. And then what might be referred to by the LGAT organizations as decisiveness, so that's how they'll market it, but impulsivity. So that's what it's described as in the DSM in terms of bipolar disorder, and also maybe something like goal-directed behavior, so really focused on getting something done. And then the other symptoms of bipolar disorder, as I said, in mania, you see psychosis, so delusions, hallucinations occasionally, that sort of thing, and often grandiose delusions. So often the delusions are what they call mood congruent. So when you're in an elevated state, your delusions tend to be like, I'm like beyond confidence, I'm the greatest person alive.
King of the world.
Yeah. And when you're depressed, then the delusions might be a lot more negative. So persecutory, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So those were the symptoms. And I saw a lot of those symptoms in participants. And then I started going onto discussion forums and reading about other people's experiences. I read dozens of articles written by people that had taken part in these seminars, but literally thousands of people online that had spoken about various things. And they weren't trying to explain to me, these are the things that I went through that were similar to the triggers of bipolar disorder. And these are the things they were just saying, my friend got divorced, or, this girlfriend of mine left me and moved in with this guy that she met, or I spent thousands of dollars on these seminars immediately after that. I didn't really have the money to spend on, or I quit my job, or, or I felt euphoric or confident. And these were things that were being marketed by these organizations when they were positive. So confidence, euphoria, productivity, energy, decisiveness, or spoken about maybe in not such a positive way by former participants in terms of impulsivity and that kind of thing. And then claims of psychosis, which had been going on, and journal articles had been written about psychosis occurring after people had participated in EST in the 70s. Examples from the 1980s, Morton Lieberman, Harkin and Adams, they spoke about psychosis in the seminars that they observed in terms of LifeSpring. But at the time, Lieberman in 1987 said, there's no reason for us to assume, based on the evidence that we've so far been able to gather, that large group awareness training could not create psychiatric risk in some. What is clearly lacking is a coherent theory to explain the relationship between what happens in those seminars and the claims of psychiatric harm that we've seen. So he was like, there's no reason for us to think that it couldn't cause problems, but we can't explain why maybe what's going on in the seminars leads to these problems. So
and
this is effectively what effectively what my research is about. So looking at all of this, I said to myself, okay, well, what are some of the theories that help to explain bipolar disorder. And there were two major theories that I looked at. So there was one that's a really early psychoanalytic, Freudian type theory. Is actually a student of Freud, Carl Abraham, and it's something called the manic defense hypothesis. And the very basic argument is that mania is a defense against feelings of inadequacy and, negative feelings about yourself. So when you're feeling low about yourself, then this unconscious force, which starts pushing against that to make you feel like you are better. So you've got this negative thing pushing you down, and you've got this unconscious force pushing you up. And the idea was that this unconscious force becomes too powerful, and it's, instead of just keeping you in balance, it elevates you way higher than you should be. And that's basically mania. And that's a very simplified explanation. The psychoanalyst
sort of a mental overcompensation for depression or for depressive thoughts or feelings.
Exactly. And I mean, homeostasis is a very well understood thing. Our brains have evolved to seek homeostasis. So if you're cold, or if you're hot, or if you're thirsty, your body and your brain does things that tries to get you back to homeostasis. And so psychological homeostasis is not a particularly wild idea. They were just using the idea of a defense mechanism to explain it.
Okay.
So there was that idea. And more recently, there's something called the dopamine hypothesis of bipolar disorder. And so there are a number of articles that speak about this. And essentially the idea is that an elevation of dopamine contributes significantly to mania, and a depletion of dopamine contributes to depression in bipolar disorder. And there's a lot of good evidence to explain this is the case. If you give people levodopa, which elevates dopamine, or amphetamines, or if you stimulate the nucleus accumbens, which is the part of the brain that dopamine targets, you start seeing hypomanic and manic-like symptoms in people. And if you stimulate the brain too much, then you actually see psychosis. So there's the dopamine hypothesis of bipolar disorder, but also the dopamine hypothesis of schizophrenia or psychosis. A lot of antipsychotic medications reduce dopamine activity. So you've got this now relationship between dopamine and these symptoms. So I'm like, okay, great.
Is this the basis of the old idea or the old mantra about a chemical imbalance in the brain?
It is. I mean, I think that's an idea that drug companies have pushed more than, I mean, I don't even know what a chemical imbalance.
It was that saying and that idea, that concept that we used to push back on when I was in part of the anti-psychiatry Scientology thing was, it's just a chemical imbalance in your brain, right? And this was. And people have said, oh, no, this has all been debunked and it's not, and this kind of thing. And yet it sounds to me, that's exactly what it sounds like to me, is you're describing an imbalance in dopamine levels. So that's why I asked.
Yeah, so I mean, the initial argument around that was focused more on serotonin. So when they started producing Prozac and those sorts of things, the very simplified marketing strategy was to say there's a lack of serotonin, and that's leading to depression, which is a very, very, very simplistic way of explaining depression. But essentially, everything about the way you think or feel or behave is governed by your brain. And so the levels of neurotransmitters or chemicals are going to be changing all the time depending on your circumstances. So to say that there's an imbalance it's a very simple way of saying it, but it is fair to say that if you've got way too much of a certain neurotransmitter at a particular time, it may affect your mood and your thinking and your behavior.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So, I think the idea being that, obviously as a marketing ploy, I suppose, but the idea being, well, look, you got too much, you got too little. We're going to give you this pill or these pills, and it's going to bring things back into a balance or a homeostasis. And that's, I mean, it's not a bizarre concept. It's just, one wonders, there's just been so much argumentation about it that I'm just trying to sort out, is it a real thing, or is it just this marketing idea? And it sounds like it's a thing, but it's not as easily but it's not just
Yeah.
a simple move a couple levers and your mood will be fine.
No, exactly. I mean, so to maybe give you a bit of context, your brain's got 100 billion neurons. Each of them are connected to 1,000 other neurons. So there's trillions of connections going around. So to be like, oh, it's just because of this one thing is
Exactly.
definitely, to call it a simplification is a simplification.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. People don't know. I mean, it's a galaxy up here. There's a universe in your head of connections, and it's really amazing. It's an amazing machine.
Yeah. So even when I'm explaining my hypothesis of what's going on, if I've got more time, I'll always couch it with there's lots of other things going on. This is just one element that seems to be quite significant. Because, for example, stress elevates endorphins, and those are feel-good internal chemicals. Stress elevates oxytocin, which has got to do with social bonding. So all of those things might explain some of the bonding people feel, some of the elevation people feel after going through something stressful. But dopamine's got a very particular fingerprint. So in terms of those things that I mentioned, euphoria, confidence, energy, decisiveness, occasionally psychosis, when you see them all clustering together and with quite a lot of regularity, it seems to be more like dopamine is involved. And also there's research to show that psychological stress elevates dopamine. So that's what I started looking into. I was like, okay, we've got these triggers. What is the relationship between them and dopamine? And since 1987, Lieberman's paper, we've discovered that acute stress causes an elevation in dopamine. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but it elevates dopamine. And the authors of these papers have kind of said it seems like dopamine plays a role in defending a person, allowing them to cope with stressful situations. And you can see why dopamine might be quite useful. It makes you feel optimistic and confident and energized and that sort of thing. So if you're made to feel guilt, shame, inadequacy, fear, like you aren't dealing with a situation, giving yourself a chemical that makes you feel like you can deal with anything seems like it will help you to achieve psychological homeostasis. So,
well, this would be the explanation for another concept that I've been wondering about for quite some time now. So let me just add to what you're saying, or ask you about this real fast, which is this very, very simple and initial concept of something can be done about it. We used to use this as a mantra in Scientology. Something can always be done about it, which is not true. Something can't always be done about it. But instilling in somebody the idea or the hope factor that something can be done about it when it comes to a situation they have can all by itself, I have noticed, produce an incredible improvement in a person. And this was this was focused around single session interventions as a modality, and just the psychoeducation component of, hey, your brain's malleable. There's plasticity. We can do something about it. That alone created such a positive effect in people who had been suffering, feeling that nothing could be done about it, and quite sure of that concept. So this can be a very transformative concept.
And hope is such a powerful thing. I mean, it's everything. You can be having the greatest meal ever, having the greatest time of your life, but if you know that something terrible is going to be happening, you're not going to be feeling good. Or you could be in a terrible situation, but if you know that things are going to get better, you're going to feel good. So the terminology used is a little bit different, but the connection really is, if you think about hope, it is the anticipation of pleasure, which is what dopamine is about.
Yeah.
That's why the rat will, and if you breed rats that have got elevated dopamine production, they will run over the most incredibly difficult electrified platforms and whatever to get to food. If they've got low dopamine, they won't. So it's about overcoming challenges. And anyone that's taken part in an LGAT knows that it's incredibly challenging. Okay, so psychological stress is going to elevate dopamine. The other thing that I found in the literature is that stress, or what's called an unpleasant state of homeostatic imbalance, is the other way of describing it, also makes the dopamine system more sensitive to rewards. So if you're in a difficult situation, if you're stressed, then if something rewarding happens, you respond to that reward in a more extreme way than you would if you weren't in a challenging situation. Does that kind of make sense?
No, it does. I was thinking about the negative connotations of that in terms of trauma bonding, but of course, there's so many positive consequences or connotations to that too. So it really is so context specific as to whether we're going to say that's a good or a bad thing. It just is a thing.
Yeah.
It's something your brain does.
So you're in this LGAT, you're experiencing stress.
Yep.
According to the literature, dopamine starts elevating to make you feel like you can deal with the situation.
Yep.
Additionally, your brain is now hypersensitive to something rewarding. Okay? And then on the final day, you get this incredible reward. You've graduated, you're wonderful, you're one of us, you're no longer an arsehole, which is what they used to refer to people as. And so you've got through this thing, which is a huge level of social reward. So based on the literature, this is going to lead to this massive elevation of dopamine. And what do you see in participants in terms of their behavior? Euphoria, confidence, energy, productivity, decisiveness, impulsivity, huge levels of motivation. You often hear about people being so invigorated and everyone's reinvigorating and changing their lives and making these big decisions. And then you hear these stories of psychosis. And as I've said, a real elevation of dopamine in anyone is going to lead to psychosis. Some people's dopamine might go there and it's kind of hypomania, it feels great, whatever. Some people there, maybe it's a bit manic, and then maybe some people there. Additionally, with some people, if you expose people to stress for too long, what's called chronic stress, then dopamine starts to become depleted. So you might start seeing depressive symptoms. And these are also things that have been reported by people as a result of participating. So again, different stress tolerances, people might respond in a different way. The majority are experiencing this high and thinking this is a great thing, but there are people on either end, some that are like, that did nothing, and then some that are maybe not responding in a good way. And
too much.
And while these organizations in the past may have been able to say, what have we got to do with these effects? Since 1987, we've been able to provide a pretty clear explanation as to why these particular activities might lead to these particular results.
Well, it also explains why they would have filtering processes of no bipolar, no psychosis, no history of mental instability.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right? Because they're trying to, bend the curve, so to speak. They're trying to, because you're talking about, this bell curve response, and they want to reduce the obviously negative outcomes, right? And again, the danger is not, it seems to me from what you've been saying, and correct, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds to me from what you're saying that basically what's happening here is an irresponsible elevation of dopamine, or of the stress induction, and then the transformation and all this stuff. This whole thing is designed to induce an elevated state so as to what happens on recruitment night? Like, what's the end goal here? It's not have an experience, goodbye, we're done with you now. I'm imagining there's more to this that is desired. It's not just a one and done, right?
Yeah. Earhart has a sales background. Hanley has a sales background. As I say, they're not psychologists. And I think that maybe was a distinction between mind dynamics and some of the early LGATs, is that there's definitely a very heavy sales focus. And this is something that they've been criticized for. You just go online and you ask people, even people that say, I think it was great and I enjoyed it, they'll say, I found that the push to recruit other people was just over the top. And so sales is a major area of focus. But one of the symptoms of hypomania and mania in terms of impulsivity is overspending. I mean, you just read studies about people that are manic and even hypomanic, running up credit card bills and spending money that they don't have. These are people that are in an ideal state to sell them something. So to push people into the state and then to ask them to sign up for further courses, I think that there are ethical issues there. If they are in a hypomanic or manic state, I think that that's a problem. And then also getting them to commit to bringing people in at the recruitment evening while they're in that state is an issue, because now they're thinking that they're permanently transformed, and they've been made to think that integrity is the most important thing in the world and commitments are the most important thing in the world.
Right.
And then they're asked to commit to bringing people in, and they're entirely responsible. So if they don't bring people in, it's entirely because of them. And so these are some of the things that are kind of going on in the background that I think are relevant. I would like to kind of just speak about the influence side of things as it relates to the elevation and mood, because I think that really closes the loop. Mm-hmm. So very basically, what I think goes on in these seminars is that they get participants to move from critical thinking to more intuitive thinking, what Kahneman would call system 2 and system 1. So system 2 is critical thinking, relying on all the evidence, taking your time, etc. System 1 is relying on heuristics. Heuristics might be something like outsourcing your thinking to the group or outsourcing your thinking to the leader if they seem like an authority figure.
Yeah, if I could stop you for just a second, because that's a word that has constantly confused me over the years. What is the word heuristics? I don't grok that concept.
Okay, so I teach undergrad psychology students, and I have to explain this to them, so hopefully this will work. So a heuristic is a cognitive shortcut. So as opposed to basically using all of the information to find something out, you use a shortcut. And let me use this as an example. If you were given a combination lock and you were told that, and say it had, I don't know, four different things of numbers on it, and you said to somebody, would you be able to figure out what the combination is? They'd say probably yes. You could start at 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 0, 0, 2,
sure.
And that wouldn't be a heuristic. That would be going through all of the information, all the possibilities until you get to the answer. It's time consuming, but it's definitely going to give you the right answer.
Right.
And then I say to my students, well, what else might you try? If you know the person, do you think that there's something that you might try? And often they'll say, oh, maybe I'd try their birthday. And I'd say, okay, yeah, that's a heuristic. So it's a shortcut that might work, and maybe it'll work a lot of the time, but it also may not work. So outsourcing your thinking to an authority figure, if you go to a doctor, you're going to say to the person, like, what should I do? And they might say, well, take these pills or exercise more, or stop eating this. And you're going to trust them. You're not going to go and get a medical degree so you can work this thing out for yourself. You're going to outsource your thinking to this person. So often we outsource our thinking to authority figures. Often we outsource our thinking to the group that we're in. So we're like, I don't really know what's going on. Let me look around and try and figure out what the right thing to do is. And in a large group awareness training, you can't speak to anyone. You can't do anything. So the leader is really controlling the room. And often people have said that there are people that are retaking these seminars. They know what the right answer is. They end up pushing the group in a particular direction, which is a form of mystical manipulation, because people will look at that person, they're getting the positive responses from this often aggressive seminar leader. And so they're like, okay, that must be the right thing to do. So those are some forms of heuristics. A primary heuristic, though, is something called the affect heuristic, which has got to do with emotions. So often we make a decision about something because of how it feels. So if we don't have the motivation or ability to think through all of the information, we might say, well, it feels good, therefore it is good.
I'd say that's the number one heuristic of human beings.
So, and by the way, this is more likely to happen in children. So children are more likely to do this because they haven't developed the critical thinking skills. So a lot of the LGAT exercises involve regression. So putting yourself in the position of being a child, you've got this sense of child-parent relationship with this person standing on a stage and that sort of thing. So the whole environment is very regressive in nature, and that primes people as well to be more likely to employ heuristics like emotion. Additionally, you've been told that understanding is the booby prize. You shouldn't try to analyze this. Trust your experience, not whatever. So you've been primed to trust an experience, and they know that they're going to be triggering this really powerful experience at the end. So you're tired, you're depleted, you haven't written anything down, you don't trust your own thinking. There's been so much information thrown at you that you can't process it. So you're relying on the trainer, you're relying on other participants who all seem to be now following what's going on. And then at the end, this really powerful positive experiences is triggered. And it becomes a substitute for real evidence and really thinking about the information presented. So that's really what's going on in my perspective from an influence perspective. There's something called the elaboration likelihood model that people can read about. You can search for it in my PhD if you want to go and find that. It's on my websites. And it explains in a bit more detail how that works. But that's essentially what's going on. So when people say, I haven't been manipulated, you want to say to them, well, have you read Kahneman? Have you read, do you know what the elaboration likelihood model is? Do you understand how your mind works and how you make decisions, particularly when you're tired, depleted, etc.? And most of them don't. So
that's right.
Yeah,
that's right. And that's the number one problem. This is why psychoeducation and what I've been doing for 10 years now, 11 years now, is trying to get people to see how they are vulnerable to these things because they don't understand how they think. They don't understand the various processes. They think the voices in their head is it, or the concepts that they think are all that the perception that's happening, or all the functioning of their brain, or whatever. And it's just not that way at all. There's all kinds of things going on up here that you're never hearing or aware of at all. It's only the stuff that sort of bubbles up to the top when you need to make a decision about something that you hear about it, and you then think, oh, well, this is all that's going on here. And it's like, no, that's not all that's going on at all. And it's these undercurrents that we're talking about that are being played. It's like you're sitting there in the pool floating along and everything's fine, and here's a guy with a great big shovel or something hitting the water, creating these waves. And you're like, where are all these waves coming from? I guess I must be doing something wrong. No, it's this guy at the end of the pool, and you don't even see him because you're not paying attention to that. Right. And yet you're getting buffeted about. That's manipulation. That's what they're doing to you, and you're not aware of it. And just because you're not aware of it doesn't mean it isn't happening. And that's really the central theme of all of this.
Yeah.
Is how are they doing these things to you? And
I think people think of manipulation always as something that happens to other people. Of course. It's never something that could happen to them.
No. Of course not. I'm impervious to that. I can see through all of that. You'd have to be an idiot to be manipulated, to join a cult, to have a negative effect happen to you in your life. It's your weakness. It's your, whatever. And as far as I can tell, the people who, routinely return to that mantra are, pretty, they're doing an awful lot of, they're building up an awful lot of ego for a reason.
Yeah.
But what you just laid out is actually really, really great, because it kind of gives that overview of, look, this is a premeditated, purposeful manipulation activity. This wasn't just organically rolled out where at the end of it, you just happen to feel the way you do. This was created. And the priming that we've talked about over and over again is so key to this, to getting you where they want you to go. And then you thinking, oh, I just arrived there naturally. I'm responsible for this, especially when they're priming you with you're responsible for everything that's happening to you.
Yeah.
You're not. You never were. It's not like that. That's not how life works, you know. So the whole thing is, you know, you can kind of miss these really huge forests for the trees. You get in all the little minutia of things and go, well, this was okay, and this was okay, and this was okay. And you go, yeah, but take a look at the bigger picture of the whole experience. You've mentioned quite a few times now, you're exhausted at the end. You've been information overloaded. You've been emotionally overloaded. You've been probably dopamine exhausted after 3 or 4 days of this. You know, then they're going to give you a break to kind of not reset, but to just kind of like recover for a day. And then they're going to hit you harder with the recruitment, with the sales. So it seems like this is all very like Scientology auditing, for example. This is a precision activity of manipulation that is designed to make it look like you're the one in the driver's seat, or you're the one who's having these experiences, and nobody's actually inducing this to, you know, on you, when in fact that's exactly what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, I almost don't want to give too much credit in terms of the thought behind it. As I say, I think that they've figured out that it works, but I'm not sure that they understand exactly why it works. I mean, I think that they're very aware that this is a very good way of they've got a product, and they found a way to package it and sell it, and I think they're very effective at that. Maybe just one last thing, because I did hear in your chat to Ann Peterson, you mentioned Robert Cialdini and influence.
Yes. Love that guy.
So you're familiar with that. So he speaks about commitment and consistency. And so Thomas Gilovich and Lee Ross, who wrote a book called The Wisest One in the Room, they're also social psychologists. They say one of the most remarkable findings in the social sciences over the last couple of decades is the idea that our behavior is a better predictor of our thinking than our thinking is of our behavior. So if you can get people to behave in a particular way, then their thinking will change so that it's in line with things that they've already done, because they don't want that cognitive dissonance. So people might look at LGATs and say, well, LGAT organizations, and say, well, they get participants to do all their recruitment for them. Why don't they just advertise above the line? And the simple answer to that would be, oh, well, it's cheaper for them to do it like that. Why pay for above the line when you've got people to do the recruiting for them? But in my view, that recruiting serves two purposes. So the one purpose is you getting free sales or salespeople, bringing people in. But the other major thing is, and I think this is why I don't know if they're aware of this, but as soon as you recruit somebody, you become psychologically bound. So if a week later you feel, oh, actually it's gone away, or I'm not feeling the same, or I've got some questions about whether I should have participated or not, if you recruited your mother or your father or your boss or your colleague or your child or somebody like that, now they've gone through the process. That makes you far more committed. And that kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier, in terms of people like yourself and Peterson and John and various other people. Now you've done something to publicly demonstrate that you are in support of this organization. It's very difficult for you to now acknowledge that there are problems with it. So it makes it less likely that you're going to look critically at the organization.
I could not agree with you more. And I'll add another layer on top of that, which is social proof. Your friends, family, if they're convinced, it's so much easier to convince you, because there's already a layer of trust and loyalty there that is being played on by them recruiting you. It's the same with the multi-level marketing, why they tell you, go for your social network, recruit your family and friends into this. Why them? Because there's already an established relationship there. So when they show up to the seminar or watch the MLM presentation, they're already biased in favor of it because of the person who introduced them to it.
Yeah, for sure.
That's
yeah.
crucial, I think, and why they don't do above the board sales is because a regular Joe off the street walks into this strange environment. No, they don't know anybody there.
Yeah.
There's no social proof for them. There's no anything. And somebody says, here's the list of rules for today. And you can't leave. You can't have your cell phone. You're going to go, what the hell? There's no trust established
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. So I think that's also crucial to that. It just so happens, by the way, I don't know if you know this or not, 75, 80% of people who get into Scientology are friends and family. It's not off the street personality tests.
Yeah.
Or book sales, right? 75%, as of 10 years ago when I left. So it's a powerful, powerful thing. I think they do it because it's the most workable way to do it. I'm of the impression, especially with somebody like an Earhart, who's somebody who, according to Annie and other people and things that I've read about him for many, many years now, this is somebody who is deeply interested in the psychology of what's going on with people. And I think he's somebody who thinks deeply about these kinds of things. But I think I agree with you that not everybody running these outfits is some kind of psychological, manipulation genius. They're just kind of organically rolling with what works. And it looks like this works. And here we go. And I think that's how most cult leaders work. They're mostly, if I go to cult leaders or predators, they're mostly creatures of opportunity, not study and diligence and discipline and let's figure this out and then go do it. It's they're doing it as they're figuring it out and working out the kinks as they go. And it just so happens that Lifton said, there's only so many ways of doing this to people.
Yeah.
It's only so many categories of activity that work. Confession, it works. That's why they do it. It solidifies loyalty. It establishes a base of trust. It opens the person up. It creates blackmail material. I mean, there's a spectrum of reasons.
It generates stress.
It's all kinds of stress and stress relief because of the release and the trust and the feels so. The emotional need of community is satisfied when there's acceptance. There's so many things going on with that one characteristic of authoritarian thought reform, which is called confession. There's a lot going on there. There's a lot going on in the sacred science bucket. There's a lot going on in the, in the doctrine over person bucket. But these come down to the ways people respond. There's only so many ways they do it, and these guys make a life study, predators make a life study out of watching people and watching how to do this and then practicing and practicing and practicing it and honing their skills. And it just so happens that people like Lifton looked at that and went, oh, well, here's what they're doing. Whether they're Chinese or whether they're North Korean or whether they're Indian or whether they're American or British, humans are humans. And we have these broad triggers or responses or things that we will respond to in general, in very generalized ways. I think that's what it comes down to, Yeah,
and I think that's why when people ask about the origins of these seminars, it's maybe easy in hindsight to kind of go, oh, well, there was this thing before that did something similar and this thing before that did something similar. But it's also a case that people are going to kind of figure these things out independently. It's like across the world, people have independently started using ayahuasca and peyote and psilocybin and various other things to facilitate mystical and religious experiences. It's not like they understood the neurobiology of what was going on. They found a plant, they ate it, and they're like, oh, this makes me feel like I'm close to God. So while we might be able to put this trail behind and kind of go, well, these were definitely the influences, and sometimes the individuals explicitly acknowledge being involved in various things, a lot of the time it may just be a case of, oh, I kind of had a couple of these things, and then we tried them out and we, tweaked it and ended up doing something very similar to these guys across the road that maybe they'd never met before. Yeah.
Exactly. All they care about at the end of the day is the bottom line. They're there to get money, influence, sex, power. They're there for very specific things, whatever the predator's goal or purpose or means to an end is. That's what they're doing, and they've decided manipulating other people into a mystical experience and then interpreting it for them as to, well, here's the explanation for it. Bang! This model works through history, over time, over space, country to country, place to place, culture to culture. This model works. You give somebody a euphoric experience. You interpret the event for them, which gives you the power and control over that event and over that experience to this person. And they consider you superior, godlike, guru-like, important, whatever. They consider you an authority. Boom, you're away. And that's it. That's all you got to really basically figure out how to do. That's your cult leader 101 in a nutshell. And large group awareness trainings is a way of doing it to a lot of people at once. A lot of cult experiences out there. Keith Raniere's NXIVM, for example, was a one-on-one. You needed that FaceTime with the guru. He had to break you down. He had to invade your space. He had to do all these things to you. Then they'll go about creating some methodology, some bridge to total freedom, some path to enlightenment, and then other people can do the work for the cult leader, but it's the same kind of thing getting done. But it's often one-on-one. With large group awareness trainings, it's a bunch of people at once.
Yeah.
Basically. And that's
and I think that the model is also slightly different, is that it tends to be a relatively high turnover model.
Oh, so I think most cults are. I think most cults are. I think
really?
Cults are a numbers game. It took 20 book sales to make a Scientologist.
Yeah, but once they were there, they seem to stick around for longer. So, I mean, a lot of people involved in LGATs might just do the weekend, and then that's there.
And then they're off. Then they're done. Yeah. It didn't quite bite with them.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the same thing with the personality tests or the introductory line, or even in TM. You're given an initial mantra and you sit there and do your chanting. Not everybody goes from that to trying to levitate with their meditation for 8 to 12 hours a day. It's a numbers game, and it is pyramid shaped. There are fewer at the top always than there are at the bottom, lower levels. And there's an awful lot of attrition in these groups. That doesn't really get talked about a lot because we talk so much about the means and methods of control and authoritarian overreach. But it's not like these methods are universal. The categories of methods are what are universal, but the exact application of them is where results are gonna vary. Scientology doesn't work on everybody, neither does TM. But
and I think that's such an important thing to mention, because you often hear people that are, let's call them cult apologists, saying things like, but only 10% of people. I think Steve Hassan mentions, somebody has this comment relating to the Moonies, and they say, but only 10% of people that go to the workshops end up joining the organization. And I think that the point is that if the processes weren't used, then 0% of people would have gone. So it increases the chances that you will buy into these ideas and that sort of thing. It just because it's not 100% effective doesn't mean that it's not doing anything. Yeah,
that's right. Well, I don't know what your thoughts are on this. Please tell me. I happen to believe at this point, after studying this stuff for a decade, that there is no such thing as a universally workable process. I don't think there is any cult that owns everybody, because I think if there were a universally workable mental control process, we'd all be in a cult now. We'd all be in that one cult. It doesn't work that way. There's too much.
I mean, certainly I agree. Yeah. I don't even think there's no debate about that. I think there's so many factors that are at play. You can do things to increase the chance of whatever. I mean, at that company that I ended up doing an LGAT through, you had to go through, like, work in all of the departments. So one of the things that I had to do was work in their telesales, because they sold insurance as one of the things that they were doing. And there were some guys who had some people who had incredibly high sales rates. So they would sell to, I don't know, 5% of the people that they called, or 10% of the people that they called. Yep. And then there were other people that maybe would sell to 1 or 2%. And then there was me who sold to 0%, because to me, it's just the worst thing I could possibly be doing. Sales is not something I'm strong at. But there was clearly something that the person selling 10% was doing that was really compelling. But
that's right.
He or she wasn't, he didn't have the silver bullet, the solution to everything. He was just better at it.
That's right. That's exactly right. And your best salespeople ever, anywhere, are going to have numbers like that. There's just no universally workable thing, right? This is why we categorize these things. We talk about, okay, confession works, but there's Catholic confession. Well, that works there. But then there's also Scientology confession here. Then there's TM confession over here. They're all doing confession, but they're not doing it the same way. And each way appeals to a different class or set of people for lots of different reasons. And we can talk about those differences. But we can also say, as a general rule, hey, you use confession, you're going to get some interesting results more often than not, out of a bunch of people. And so there's a mechanism for you. There's a tool in your toolkit, Mr. Cult Leader, that you can use. That doesn't mean confession as a activity is inherently evil or manipulative. It means it can be used that way. Yeah. That's kind of what we're saying with this stuff. And when you have people who are taking in millions and millions of dollars through deceptive means and taking advantage of people by basically misdirection. It looks like I'm doing this to you when I'm actually doing this to you. And I'm going to get away with fooling you into misdirecting you about what just happened to you. I don't think that's right, and there's lines in the sand we draw when it comes to fraud and this kind of thing that I think apply here in these circumstances. And I think this is why we have talks like this, is so that we can get people to understand this is manipulative. It's actually doing something wrong to people. Even if it's only working on 10% of them, it's still wrong.
And I think that my attitude to LGATs and to, I guess, any of these organizations is just that there needs to be open dialogue. So, my idea isn't, that all that I think should happen is that we have these conversations. People are exposed to information. They can make an informed decision about whether they want to participate. That, to me, it's really just that they should have access to that information. And I mean, it's taken me a long time to study these things. I've been doing it since 2010, so 14 years. But there's really a pretty easy and accelerated learning process for anyone who's now interested in trying to understand them. I mean, there's certainly some garbage in my PhD. I was maybe a little bit elevated when I was writing some of it, but anything that you really want to know is covered in that. And if that's too much effort, and it is probably a fair amount of effort, then watch a video or two. You can go from knowing nothing about these seminars and how they work to knowing a lot about them in a very short period of time. Simply watching this episode, I think it covers the most of the basics. And
Yep.
I think that if that information is shared, it doesn't have to be confrontational in terms of how we interact with these organizations and with people that are participants, and particularly with people that are advocates of the organizations. I think that any hostility is kind of showing a lack of understanding, because these people have gone through these seminars, they found something beneficial in them, they've maybe recruited family and friends, maybe they've assisted or volunteered and whatever, and now they're being possibly confronted with information that is incredibly difficult to grapple with. And
yes.
It's so tempting to kind of stand and say, I was right and you are wrong. I'm part of the group that understands and you're part of the group that doesn't understand, which is often the mentality when you in these groups. I think that making the transition for people to move out of the organizations and framing it as what I really think it is something incredibly brave and courageous and whatever is how it should be looked at. Yeah.
I could not agree with you more. I really hope I'm not coming across as snarky. I'm sure I hope I don't overall.
No, that wasn't the case.
And but I just want to say that out loud because I want to. I've been through this process myself. Yes. And I don't apply words like courageous to myself. So I don't I don't want to pillar myself here, but it's hard. Yeah. It's a struggle. It's difficult to acknowledge that we were fooled by something. And in saying that, and this is, I've led with this before. I'll say this again because you're making great points here, John, about this. It's not an effort of this show or my channel. I don't think it is. I certainly don't think it is of your work to tell you didn't have an experience or that your feelings aren't relevant or true, or you didn't feel the way you felt, or you didn't make improvements in your life as a result. Maybe you did. Yeah. Maybe maybe you finally got your shit together. Maybe you finally organized and cleaned your room. Maybe you finally got that job you needed because you finally put in enough work to get it because of that elevated feeling, because of the impetus or the inspiration or the motivation that was there. I would never dream of trying to take that away from you or tell you that was wrong or immoral or bad. That's the people at the receiving end of the manipulation are not the bad guys here, and that's not the effort to frame members of a group as the bad guys or as people who don't know what they're talking about. That's not at all the way I'm coming at this, and I know it can be confrontational or adversarial in some of the things that maybe I say. And I don't want it to be that way. I want it to be that this is an effort at enlightenment, at education, at here's what. Yes, something happened to you. A lot of things happened to you. And here's some more information about what those things were.
Yeah.
You decide based on this new information that we're now giving you. Was that a net positive or a net negative? Only you can answer that for yourself. It's not my place to tell you your LGAT was an abusive, horrible experience for you.
Yeah.
I want to point out, though, that things were being done to you that you may not be aware of. And I hope that filters into your thinking as a result of watching this show or watching my channel. That's all I'm trying to do here.
Yeah. And I mean, I certainly can't comment on Scientology. I would say that with large group awareness training, what you often hear is people saying, I would recommend it to anybody. And that to me is something that I think there needs to be pushback on, because clearly it doesn't work for everyone. And if you think that it does, then you haven't been given the right information.
That's right.
I mean, just go online and And, I've seen this with Scientology to some degree with that. Like, oh no, that's just, a handful of upset people that had bad experiences. And you're like, no, there's a lot of people that have had negative experiences, and they need to be taken seriously. So
That's right.
you can say objectively, I feel like I had a great experience. I learned X and Y and Z, and I achieved all of these things. Fine. I'm comfortable with that. But to say this is something that works for everyone, and I'll recommend it to everyone, you have to say, well, objectively, that's not a good idea, because some people clearly don't have good experiences, and you don't have to do that much investigation to realize that fact.
That's right. That's right. It's the invitation to the audience to not be a totalist or black and white thinker. It's not all good, all bad, all right, all wrong. That's the kind of thinking cults want you to be thinking like.
Well, that's the sacred science.
I did that for decades. I've been there.
Yeah.
The world is not that. It never was that. We develop or create constructs in our minds to represent reality, heuristics, and we run with them. But it's not the real world. And we have to stop and question our heuristics sometimes. We have to question our models of reality and how we think about things. And in those areas, my number one piece of thematic content is stop and think. Just take a look at what's happened to you, why did it happen to you, and if it was a bad thing, how do you prevent it from happening in the future? Well, let's look at the red flags and let's figure it out. And if it was a good thing, great. But like you just said, John, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a universally good thing for everybody. Just because you like the Twinkie doesn't mean everybody else is going to like the Twinkie. Doesn't always work that way. And just because the Twinkie made you feel good for a minute doesn't mean that it was good for you or that it's good for anybody else. And that's sort of what I would like people to walk away thinking about.
Yeah.
So, John, this has been a great talk. I want to thank you for taking the time to talk to me today.
No, it's been great. Yeah.
I really appreciate it. Your work is awesome. I could not, I've arrived at a lot of what you said, but so much of what you said, I was like new to me, like, oh, really? It's this and this. Oh, that's what the serotonin, the dopamine, the this, that. Great stuff. I really, really, really appreciate you bringing some clarity to this picture and putting as much time into working on and researching this as you have. Hell, you become a doctor over this. That is impressive. How do people find you and your work? I want to link your website. There's some great papers available on there. There's other interviews you've done on there. Where do they find you? JohnHunterPhD.com. That's simple. And if somebody wanted to email you or contact you, is there a contact form on there?
There is, yeah.
Great. Okay, so johnhunterphd.com, link below in the description section to this video, and on the podcast website on my Podbean site. So if you guys are curious about John's work, definitely go and check it out. His website's fun. What are you thinking is in your future as far as this goes? Is this a continuing work for you? Are you continuing to research in this field or area, or where are you going?
I am actually, but it was something that I was trying to get away from. I mean, it's quite a dark area to be involved in. The organizations involved, as you've mentioned, have got a reputation for being litigious. And you're also hearing stories about people that some people have had really terrible experiences in some of these groups. I mean, I spoke to a woman in Los Angeles, and she had recruited her sister to participate, and her sister had a psychotic break while she was participating in something called Mastery and Transformational Training, which is an offshoot of LifeSpring. And another woman who participated in that same seminar, she got in her car, drove. I think she drove across the country. So drove across the country with her mother after the seminar. She did MITT, got to New York, and then walked into, I don't know what's the major river in New York. So she was psychotic and very depressed and didn't know what was going on. And she walked into this freezing cold water to try to kill herself and was pulled out by an undercover police officer. I've got another person who's been chatting to me in South Africa. Her daughter, took part in a very similar seminar and has been, for the last couple of years has been, diagnosed with schizophrenia, sits in her room, just reads her Bible all day, doesn't open the windows. So there's some people that have these really terrible experiences, and a lot of people contact me and will say things like that. I think underneath your last video, I was reading through some of the comments, and a woman mentioned that her friend, a friend of hers took part in one of these seminars, and she was bipolar, and she had severe problems after taking part and ended up taking her life. And so there's a lot of, and again, it's very difficult to say, oh, well, it was because of this seminar. So it's very hard to make that case. But these are things that we really need to be taken seriously. But for me, dealing with those kinds of things has been emotionally very challenging. However, nobody else has done research on these seminars, as far as I can tell, since the early 1990s. So I feel like I want as many people as possible to understand it. I don't mind if other people take my work and become experts on it based on my work, but I do feel that the conversation has to happen. I recently was involved in I can't speak about it too much because it hasn't been finalized, but it involved kids in the troubled teen industry in the United States.
Yes. Yeah.
So they are basically using LifeSpring seminars on these teenagers who have all got mental health conditions, and it's not even like, maybe it's LifeSpring. There's a guy, David Gilcrease, who is a LifeSpring trainer, and he started an organization called Resource Realizations, and WASP seminars were using this guy in his seminars. So I'm listening to people speaking about going through these seminars at these troubled teen schools, and they're doing the red and black game. They're doing the LifeSpring game. They're using terminology like grungies. They've got certain rules. It's all, as far as I can tell, pretty much a carbon copy. So you've got LifeSpring that was sued 30 to 35 times for mental health injuries. And this was on supposedly healthy adults. And now you're using the same processes or very similar processes on this very vulnerable group of adolescents. So there is work that I want to do. I think that they need to be studied properly, and more studies need to be published, because at the moment there's not a lot, but I think that there's a lot that can be done.
Yeah, I agree. Wow. It is dark, isn't it? I mean, I've been in this for years. It's emotionally challenging is a great way to describe it. Frequent breaks. There's various ways we all cope with this stuff. Because oh boy, when you bring up troubled teen industry, I just there's a whole nother thing I haven't even barely lifted the cover on. That's a whole nother subject of awful that goes on. People struggle in this world, and people struggle with the people who struggle to try to figure out how to help them. And it would be really, really great if we had all the right answers for all the right situations. We have a lot of answers. One of the biggest problems is there's not enough people out there delivering the solutions. And another one of the biggest problems, the biggest problem, is not enough people even know we have the answers or some answers or solutions. And they turn to these alternative
Yeah.
Horrible things, like what you just described. And it's very frustrating. It's very, very frustrating to watch this, because it's not a matter of we're just trying to stop everything. Well, stop that. That's wrong. And that's wrong too. There are things to do. It's just, okay. Anyway, John, again, sorry, I'm trying to wrap this up, so I'll stop talking.
Yeah.
Thank you very much again for taking the time. I hope people check out your website. I'm definitely going to check out your work. There is your full PhD. There's also some shorter articles and some shorter interviews there that people can check out. I really, really recommend, if you're curious about this stuff, that you do so. If you are not yet subscribed to my podcast here, Speaking of Cults, then please do so. And please like, share, get this around on the interwebs. It's the only way that I can get this information out there is with your help. The person who is watching or listening to this right now. So like and share, be family and friends for my channel. All right, folks, I will see you guys next week. Bye-bye.